The silk was too heavy for her shoulders. The veil scratched her cheek. Her shoes pinched against the stones. She was only 8 years old, standing before a coffin too long for her eyes to take in, too short to carry everything she had lost. Her parents were gone, and in their place, strangers. Strangers who smiled too wide, bowed too low, whispered too loudly. They called it a funeral, but to her it felt like a sale. The nobles circled, eyes sharp, not with grief, but with calculation. Whispers of inheritance, whispers of alliances, whispers about the child who no longer had a shield. She was an orphan, but not alone. Because in courts, orphans aren't children, they're pawns. And as the incense burned and the bells tolled, the little girl's future was already being traded across a table she wasn't allowed to sit at. The silk dress wasn't hers. The pearls weren't hers. Even the tears on her cheek didn't belong to her. A hand pressed against her back, guiding her forward. Another hand patted her hair too firmly, as if testing a possession. She wanted to run. But where do you run when the walls themselves are cages? At 8, they thought she was powerless. At 8, they thought she was silent. At 8, they thought she would vanish into history as another forgotten daughter. They were wrong, because silence is not emptiness. Silence listens. Silence remembers. Silence sharpens. And this little girl, the orphan wrapped in silk, would grow sharper than any sword in that hall. By 16, the same nobles who whispered over her fate would whisper her name in fear. This is how she conquered a court, without ever wearing a crown. She was 8, and in a single breath childhood ended. Her parents' bodies were lowered into the ground, but what truly buried her was the decision made above her head. Guardianship, not love, not family. Guardianship. She was handed, like an heirloom too valuable to leave unattended, to relatives who smiled for the court but whispered in corridors. They didn't call her by her name. They called her the girl, the orphan, the ward. Every whisper carried the same weight. Not grief, not pity, but calculation. She had land now. She had bloodlines. She had worth. Not in who she was, but in what she could be traded for. Inheritance was a weapon. Alliances were a game. And she was the pawn. At night, she still hugged the wooden doll her mother gave her. But by morning, that doll was tucked away, because the court didn't want to see a child. They wanted to see an investment. She learned quickly that laughter drew frowns, that running in corridors earned slaps, that questions were dangerous, because answers were delivered with cold stares and colder hands. Sit straight. Speak less. Smile when spoken to. Every correction was a lesson carved into her skin. She bruised easily, and silk was the perfect disguise. The first time a hand struck her, she didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because she had already learned that tears only fed the cruelty. So she swallowed the pain. She folded it deep inside where no one could reach. And every time they pressed her into silence, she listened harder. She listened to the way a lord's voice cracked when debts were mentioned, to the way a lady's eyes darted when rumours of betrayal circled, to the way servants exchanged glances when orders grew cruel. She listened and she remembered. Because if she couldn't speak, she could store. If she couldn't fight, she could wait. The child they believed obedient was only learning the rules of a game she'd never chosen to play. Every bruise was a page, every scolding was a sentence, every silence was a lesson. And behind her lowered eyes she was already writing a story none of them would see coming. At 8, she was broken into silence. At 9, she became invisible. But invisibility is only dangerous if the person you ignore is still watching. And she was watching. Because though they stole her childhood, They gave her something far sharper in return. They gave her the art of survival. She was still a child, still clutched her doll at night, still traced shapes in the dirt with her fingers when no one was watching. But the court decided she was ready for something else. Marriage, not love, not laughter, not freedom, marriage. At 10 they began to shape her. Not her heart, not her mind, her posture, her smile, her silence. Sit straighter. Hands folded, eyes lowered. Don't speak unless spoken to. Every day became rehearsal for a role she'd never auditioned for. When her feet swung beneath the dining bench, she was wrapped across the ankles. When she laughed too loudly, the sound was smothered with a scolding hand. When she asked why she couldn't run, why she couldn't play, why she couldn't speak, the answer was always the same: discipline, correction, training. Bruises were called lessons. Fear was called obedience. Her silence was called grace. But beneath the bows and curtsies, beneath the careful smile she was taught to wear, something else was happening. They thought they were shaping her into a bride. They were wrong. They were sharpening her into something far more dangerous. Because in the stillness, she listened. In the silence, she learned. In the obedience, she waited. At first, she thought her silence was weakness, proof that they had won, proof that she had nothing left. But one night, as she sat by the fire, hands folded, eyes lowered, she understood. No one noticed her anymore. No one thought she mattered. And that was her freedom. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. It was a mask. It was survival. They thought she was quiet because she was obedient. But she was quiet because she was watching. Because every word they spoke, every gesture they made, every secret they whispered, she collected them. Like coins, like weapons, like keys to doors they never meant to open for her. By 11, they believed she was tame. By 12, they believed she was harmless. But she knew the truth. A quiet girl is never empty. She's a vessel, filling. And one day, the silence they forced on her would speak louder than all their commands. By the time she was 10, she had learned the art of vanishing, not with footsteps, not with shadows, but with silence. She sat at long tables, among lords and ladies, their voices clattering like cutlery. And no one noticed her. No one asked her thoughts. No one cared where her eyes wandered. She was silk in a chair, a child dressed like a doll, a presence so muted they forgot she was even there. And that was her power. Because when people think you're harmless, they stop guarding their words. They talked around her as if she were furniture, affairs, debts. Plots whispered between gulps of wine. Secrets spilled across silver plates. She remembered every syllable. The steward who cheated the accounts. The bishop who drank when he swore to fast. The cousin who feared his wife more than the king. All tucked away in her mind. She learned when to smile, when to nod, when to let her gaze linger just long enough to make someone feel understood. A servant once slipped her an extra slice of bread. She smiled. The next week, that same servant whispered gossip to her no one else had heard. A noble dropped a ring, and she bent quickly to pick it up. He called her a sweet child. 2 days later, he confided in her, thinking she would forget. She didn't. Little favours, little nods, little silences that stretched just long enough to make people believe she was safe. But she wasn't safe. She was listening. The servants began to trust her because she never repeated their whispers. The nobles underestimated her because she never spoke unless asked. And in that invisibility, she built her camouflage. At 12, she could walk into a crowded hall, stand in plain sight and vanish. Not because they couldn't see her, but because they refused to, and that was their first mistake. Because a ghost in silk sees everything and remembers everything, and one day that memory becomes a weapon no one expects. She didn't study books, she studied people, every glance, every pause, every slip of the tongue. By 13, she had turned silence into her classroom. She knew which lord boasted the loudest, because lies always need an audience. She knew which bishop drank too much during fasts, because guilt always leaves stains. She knew which knight feared being ignored, because his temper rose whenever the room grew quiet. And she remembered it all. They thought she was quiet because she was obedient, but she was quiet because she was learning, because people reveal themselves when they believe no one is listening. She watched how a man leaned closer when he lied, how a woman's voice trembled when she spoke of debts, how pride turned into confession when given the right nod, the right silence, the right smile. And slowly she began to test it. A single word dropped at the perfect moment, a question asked with feigned innocence, a silence held long enough to make someone keep talking, desperate to fill it. She discovered something terrifying. She didn't need force. She didn't need threats. She didn't even need a crown. All she needed was to know what they wanted. Because a man who craves respect can be flattered into foolishness. A woman who hides secrets can be teased into revealing them. A rival who fears irrelevance can be destroyed with nothing more than indifference. Power doesn't begin with strength. It begins with knowing. Knowing what someone desires. Knowing what someone fears. Knowing where the cracks live beneath the armour. And once you know, you don't have to strike. You only have to press. By 13, she no longer played the pawn. She played the board. The same silence they forced upon her had become her greatest weapon. Every insult became a clue. Every dismissal became a lesson. Every punishment became a map of weakness. She didn't resist anymore. She redirected. She didn't fight. She maneuvered. And without ever raising her voice, without ever breaking the mask of obedience, she became something far more dangerous than a rebel. She became a strategist. The child they once silenced had learned the truth, that the most powerful voice in the room is often the one that doesn't speak at all. The hall was glowing with candlelight, silver cutlery, golden goblets, nobles laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. She sat 3 seats down, quiet, still, the orphan in silk. The ghost no one noticed. And then it happened. A lord leaned back in his chair, wine staining his lips, arrogance dripping from every word. He made a joke. Not just any joke. One of those jokes that circles a woman's worth like a vulture. Sharp enough to draw a laugh. Cruel enough to wound. The room erupted. Chuckles, snickers. Even her guardian's lips twisted into a grin. She did not laugh. She did not lower her eyes. She looked up, and for the first time she spoke. If your wit were as sharp as your sword, perhaps you'd still have both hands. The room froze. A goblet slipped. A man choked on his pheasant, and the lord, staring at her as if the chair itself had spoken, turned pale. Silence. The kind of silence that weighs more than noise. And then the whispers began. The orphan had teeth. The ghost in silk had a tongue, and her words cut deeper than any blade. That night, punishment came. A slap. Another. Her cheek burned. But this time, she didn't cry. She smiled, because she understood. He struck her not out of power, but out of fear. Fear that others had heard her. Fear that the illusion had cracked. The nobles who once ignored her now stole glances. The women leaned in closer when she passed. The men lowered their voices when she entered the room. She was no longer invisible. She was unpredictable, and unpredictability is dangerous. They could pretend she was still obedient, still docile, still harmless. But they knew now, behind the silence was something sharp, something patient, something that had waited years for just one chance to bleed through. And this was only the beginning, because once silence has been broken, it can never be caged again. By 14, the ghost in silk had become something else, not just a listener, not just an observer, but a player. Her allies were not warriors, they were not generals, they were the women at court who knew how to trade whispers sharper than any sword. They were the servants who slipped notes through corridors and shared secrets over candlelight. Even men, foolish enough to mistake her careful nods and soft words for admiration, became tools in her hand. She wrote letters now. At first, thank yous, then favours, then requests so small they seemed harmless. But every note carried weight, every reply tied another thread to her web. By 15, she didn't need to shout to be heard. Her silence spoke for her. Her reputation moved faster than her footsteps. People began to notice strange things. A steward who once mocked her, sent abroad never to return. A cousin who questioned her place at the table, stripped of lands within a year. A priest who had married her at 10, vanished without ceremony. No one could trace it back to her. No one dared to ask. But the pattern was there. Those who opposed her fell, and those who stood near her rose. Estates shifted hands, alliances crumbled quietly, and still she smiled. Polite, measured, harmless. At least that's what they told themselves. Because what frightened them most wasn't what she said, it was what she might say next. And so they gave her space, they gave her deference, they gave her power, without ever naming it. By 16, she didn't need a throne. She didn't need a crown. The court already bent around her like glass under pressure. She had mastered the art of control without ever raising her hand. Whispers obeyed her. Rumours protected her. Silence crowned her. And the nobles who once dismissed her as a child now avoided her gaze. Not out of respect, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Because they had finally understood. The girl they thought invisible was now the mastermind who owned the board. At 16, the portrait shows her calm, composed, unreadable. The brushstrokes capture a girl with folded hands, pearl-threaded sleeves, eyes steady but distant, a child still in years, but no longer in power. Courtiers bowed when she entered. Priests asked her counsel on matters of faith. Nobles lowered their voices in her presence, afraid that even silence might betray them. She had no crown, no throne, no title, and yet she ruled. Not through decrees, not through armies, but through whispers. A single look from her could end a conversation. A single pause could unravel a man's confidence. A single word, dropped with precision, could shift the balance of an entire council. She had learned the timing of power, when to speak, when to smile, when to say nothing at all, because memory was her arsenal. Every secret stored, every weakness catalogued, every lie filed away, ready to be unsealed at the perfect moment. Silence was her shield. She gave them nothing to strike, nothing to accuse, nothing to hold against her, and timing was her sword. The unseen blade she wielded with elegance, striking only when the room was unguarded, when the blow would land deepest. The girl they once ignored now walked through gilded halls like a storm disguised in silk, unpredictable, untouchable, uncrowned but undeniable. Her presence alone shifted the air. Men stopped speaking when she entered. Women straightened their backs. Servants moved quicker, careful not to cross her path. The orphan at 8 had been powerless. But the woman at 16 was inevitable, and though no crown had touched her head, no throne bore her weight. Everyone in that court knew the truth. She didn't need to wear power, she was power. The orphan at 8 was never supposed to matter. She was supposed to be forgotten, a pawn in someone else's game, a girl buried in silk and silence. The girl at 16 was never supposed to rule. She had no crown, no throne, no title carved into stone, and yet she conquered, not with armies, not with swords, but with memory, with silence, with timing. History teaches us to look at kings, crowns, coronations, but real power often moves where the eyes don't look, in the pauses, in the whispers, in the shadows. She was proof of it, proof that power isn't given, it's taken, quietly, patiently, precisely. The orphan they dismissed became the storm they feared. The ghost in silk became the mastermind without a throne. And history shows us this. Crowns don't make rulers, shadows do. If you're still here, it means you've heard her story. A story they tried to erase. A story written in silence, carried in bruises, hidden in corridors. And there are more voices like hers, more lives' history buried under marble and gold. If you want to hear them, if you want to bring their voices back from the shadows, subscribe, because their silence ends here.